Hey everybody, my name is Mark Coffin. I coach conscious leaders who are trying to bring something new, create something new, or do something in the world that hasn't been done before. Today in the video, I want to talk about why conscious leaders need to meditate. This topic is one that I actually have like a little bit of hesitation speaking on, because it hasn't been part of my past to be prescriptive and to say, this is what needs to happen, this is what should happen. But I guess what I'm going to try and do today is really articulate why I don't think you can be a conscious leader if you don't have a meditative practice. Now, maybe Eckhart Tolle says he doesn't meditate. Maybe you've already reached full enlightenment, full realization, and you no longer need a practice like this. But what I hope to do in this video is explain why not only it's, I think, dangerous to not have meditation or some kind of practice that helps you discern yourself from your ego, but just why by definition alone, it's almost impossible to be a conscious leader if you don't meditate, if you don't have a practice of meditating regularly. So first things first, let's talk about what it means what that phrase means. What is a conscious leader? Let's start with the word leader. I like a definition of leader that is sort of a mix of ones I've heard over the years, but I think a leader is anybody who's trying to make something happen that wouldn't happen without their involvement, that wouldn't happen without their own initiative, that wouldn't happen if they didn't step up and choose themselves to do something in the world that nobody is asking them specifically to do. It might be the case that many people think that thing needs to be done. It might be the case that many people think someone else should do it, but nobody's pointing at you specifically and saying, why don't you do that? If somebody has asked you to do something and you're doing something in the world and you're doing that thing, I would argue that the person who asked you to do the thing is the real leader in that scenario. But if you're asking yourself, if you're doing something where you're getting out of bed every day, day after day, and staying committed to the task that you assigned yourself, staying committed to the project or the vision that you assigned yourself, and bringing that forth into the world, and I would argue that that makes you a leader. And there's a lot of people that I also think should meditate that are probably not the perfect fit for this definition. So if that is you, then you're certainly welcome to listen to this video. You're certainly welcome to watch this video. But this video is really targeted at people who are taking their own initiative. I saw a talk several years ago where the speaker, it's actually my friend Dave, went through a list of common hero types in movies that we were all familiar with. And he said there's a myth that's provoked here is that, with the Harry Potter myth, with the Lord of the Rings myth, that in some way they were pre-selected for their experience. They were pre-selected to be a leader in the way that they showed up in these films and books and other forms of media. And the reality in real life is that there's nobody saying, well, it should be you. Well, it should be you. That will happen to some people. But it is not the kind of leadership that he was arguing in that talk. And I'm echoing in this one that we need. What it means to be a leader is to decide to step up and lead people, create something, mobilize yourself, mobilize other people to fight for a cause. And that takes a kind of spark that I think we have inside, each of us has inside of us. And at some point, we all have an option to decide that we're going to take something seriously. And there's something about it that's it's not just a decision you make one time, but it's one you make again and again and again and again. Okay, so that's what it means to be a leader. What does it mean to be conscious? In the context of leadership, I think to be conscious means to become increasingly aware. I don't know that there is an end state of consciousness or awareness. On my own journey, it sure seems like there are always new things I'm discovering about myself. Specifically in the context of leadership, I think we want to be conscious of, well, I'll talk about 3 areas, and I want to use the metaphor of an iceberg. So if you think of an iceberg, floating along in the ocean, there is a portion of the iceberg that is visible above the water line. And then there's a much larger portion of the iceberg that's invisible, that's below the water line. And for the portion of the iceberg that's below the water line, it's there, but we're not conscious of it. We'll use the iceberg as a metaphor for the mind, your inclinations and the machinations of your mind. Some of those things happen above the surface, and some of those things happen below the surface where it's not, immediately conscious to you how or why it's happening. So, for example, if somebody were to walk into this room right now and ask me what I'm doing, well, I would say I'm recording a video on conscious leadership. That's pretty obvious, and it's easy for me to say that because that's what I'm doing. You know that. As soon as I tell them, or if they were to listen for a while, they would know that. It's obvious. You could also think of what's conscious as, what's obvious or what's overt. What's less conscious is the answers to 2 other questions. And if the question that was obvious above the surface line was what, then the questions that are less obvious are how, and even less obvious, why. How are you recording a video on conscious leadership? How'd you do it? How are you doing it? Well, I could think through all of the steps that had to go right, but actually it's not conscious to me. It's so not conscious to me that it's either intuitive or I have to reference a checklist that I have. That's like, have I followed all the steps I have to take on the way to recording a video? There's stuff that has to happen with the camera. There's stuff that has to happen with the microphone and the audio interface that you can't see because it's plugged into here and here. And, some of it is stuff that I learned from being a musician and how to route cables and that kind of. So it's a less conscious answer, but it doesn't mean it's not active. It just means it's below the surface. It's actually not helpful while I'm recording this video for me to be thinking about how I'm recording this video. I kind of just have to press all the buttons, get ready to speak, and just hope that everything is still going well while I'm saying this. I'm tempted to check, and yes, we are recording. You knew that because you're watching the video, but I had to check because it wasn't conscious. So what? Then below the surface is how. If you ask me to explain how I'm recording a video or how I'm going to do whatever it is that I do next after I'm finished recording the video, I can explain it, but it's going to be quicker if I just move along and do it based on letting the subconscious run the show. Underneath how, deeper, further below the surface, is the question, why? Why am I recording a video on conscious leadership? Now, if how was hard to explain, if how required me to go into my subconscious and sort of remember all of the steps to the thing, the why of how I'm recording a video on conscious leadership is an even more challenging question to answer, because it gets at the root of, I think of it, the answer to why is always a vision, if you have one. If you don't have an answer to why, then there's still a vision, I guess you could answer that with, in terms of when I do record a video on conscious leadership, there will be a result. And that result is the vision I'm working towards. In my case, the answer would be something like, well, I've felt a calling to work with leaders who are trying to become more conscious, who are already conscious and looking for companionship on their path, who are looking for support on what is often a very lonely path of conscious leadership, And, I've walked down that road. I've run organizations. I've run campaigns. I've taken on lots of projects where I've felt challenged by the questions related to being a conscious leader. But ultimately, the answer to that question is going to be very, very personal for most people. Vision is something that exists within our mind, deep within our mind. And to actually get to that point where we're consciously acting in a way that is coherent with the vision we have for the world and taking actions in the direction of that vision, in pursuit of that vision, actions that are more likely to bring about the realization of that vision than not, to actually get to the point where you can stand straight and say, yeah, this is my vision. This is why I'm recording a video on conscious leadership, or this is why I want to run for a certain kind of political office, or this is why I want to build a company that serves a certain kind of product or delivers a certain kind of service to a certain kind of customer. That takes a fair amount of forethought and a fair amount of planning. And in this video, I wanted to talk about the reasons why conscious leaders should meditate. Ego is something that will get in the way of all of the things I just described. We have two competing thought systems inside of us. A thought system that wants to grow and evolve, a thought system that is almost like still developing, like we're still developing the words to speak about the thing we want to become because we're becoming it every day. And ego is attached to the past. Ego is reminding us of our failures, reminding us of our vulnerabilities, reminding us of all the things we haven't successfully done in the past, reminding us of things our harshest critics have said, reminding us of things maybe if we have enemies have said about us or threatened to do to us. I think most people get involved in some kind of leadership, any of the kinds I described, some kind of creating something, some kind of act of trying to mobilize other people to do something that I think the instinct to be involved is almost always trustworthy. The instinct to lead is almost always one that people should listen to and nurture. And almost as soon as one does, what happens on the path is that we become our own worst enemies. Ego begins to say things that are some of the most critical things that could be said about us. And I've said this before in other videos, that the voice of ego is trying to protect an earlier version of ourselves. The voice of ego is trying to protect what it thinks we are. So in meditation, what happens is you sit with your thoughts. And you sit with your thoughts for a long enough period of time that it isn't particularly comfortable. The focus of most meditations is to bring your attention to something relatively stable, like your breath, your heartbeat, or if you do an eyes open meditation, maybe a candle or a flame. I remember the first time I tried to meditate, I read a book, picked up a book at the library in Cape Breton, and I think it was called Mind Over Matter. It was a really old book. Felt like it was printed in like the 80s. Well, this was like 2005. And I'm flipping through the pages, and it said something along the lines of, like, if you're trying to meditate for the first time, maybe put this book down and come back in 10 years' time. And if you'd still like to try meditating, then that's probably a sign that it's a practice for you. I don't know if I would give that warning to others, but it is a serious practice, and it can lead to major shifts in how you perceive reality if you commit to it over time. The practice is you focus on your breath, or you focus on your candle, and you don't let the thoughts that are coming into your mind sway you from your intention. Of course, anybody who's meditated will tell you that they still struggle with not, for the most part, at least this is my experience, that there's still times when thoughts come in and capture my attention. And I've been doing it over 15 years now. Thoughts come in and capture my attention, but the practice is simply to remind yourself where you intended your attention to be. Bring it back to my breath. And what happens in time is that the thoughts almost become something like the noise in a cafe. To know that there is no noise in a cafe that is full of noise would be a weird thing, right? It's almost the same way with your mind. Like, I don't think the thoughts truly slow down, but you can move your attention to a place. I've been trying to follow the emotional experience, and usually happens in my core. So if I have thoughts in my head, maybe I'm reliving a story that happened earlier in the week or earlier in my life at some point. If the thoughts that are moving around my head have a particular emotional tone, I'll just say, okay, I'm going to follow the emotional tone of what's happening. And once you train yourself to put your attention there instead of here, you begin to feel a lot of things that weren't necessarily palpable to you before. And you begin to see that, oh, my mind isn't actually responsible for resolving this, but I am responsible for feeling the feelings associated with this. If you think of it from an evolutionary perspective, feelings would have emerged far earlier on the course of our development as a species. This evolved before this. Like, we share this with most other mammals. We don't share the same kind of frontal cortex with most other mammals. And you can see, watching animals like dogs and cats, if they're seriously abused, they retain some of the fear from their past experiences. But if they're generally living a decent life, they can get spooked. They can have startles, and they just shake them off right away. Or if you watch a dog sleep or an animal sleep, you can see that they're processing their experience, but they're doing it with their bodies. And of course, we didn't lose those abilities. We just developed a mind that became more adept at claiming the problem solver role, at claiming events and experiences as something to hold on to. And that turned into ego. So if you're a leader and you meditate, the promise is that you get to learn how to navigate your ego and see who you really are. You get to learn how to navigate your ego and see who you really are. Because ego is a sense of self, but it's not self. Ego is a sense of separate self, but you're not separate from all of this. There's one consciousness animating all of this. And the ego is committed to telling you a story that you're separate. It's a separation device. It's a device for keeping us separate. Maybe in a future video, we'll talk about some of the tools that ego offers, or why do we have ego? Why does it exist? If it, as I'm describing in this video, could be such a barrier to authentic, conscious leadership. Why have it at all? All right, I'm going to leave it there for today.